April, 1798. A thick, suffocating mist clings to the surface of Lake Lucerne, smelling of damp stone and freezing alpine water. For 400 years, this water has been a mirror, reflecting an unchanging world of prayer and stone. But this morning, the mirror is shattered. From the north, the sound arrives first, a thunderous rhythmic drumbeat that Lucerne has never heard. Then, through the fog, the Blue Jackets appear, the French Revolutionary Army. These are not just soldiers, they are the disciples of a new god called Reason. They carry the tricolor flag, vibrant red, white, and blue, cutting through the gray Swiss morning like a razor. As they march past the Musegg Wall, the heavy oak gates of the city groan on rusted hinges. To these soldiers, Lucerne is not a holy sanctuary. It is a museum that has stayed open far too long. Their message is carved into the smoke of their muskets. The old world is dead. The living fossil of Europe has finally been forced to breathe the air of a new century. To witness this vanished world before it fell, we have harnessed the power of advanced AI technology to transform 18th century engravings and paintings into photorealistic scenes. This process is more than mere animation. It is a meticulous digital restoration that bridges 3 centuries. By analyzing the intricate lines of period artworks, the AI has reconstructed the depth, light, and texture of a lost era. Every weathered plank on the chapel bridge and every marble vein within the Jesuit Church has been rendered to offer a truly immersive experience. You are no longer just looking at a flat image. You are stepping into a 3-dimensional history. This technology allows us to move beyond the boundaries of ink and paper, inviting you to walk through the narrow, lightless alleys and stand in the shadow of the fortified walls as they existed in the 1700s. This is a digital odyssey where modern algorithms become the key to unlocking the secrets of the past. Why did the fall of this tiny town, a place of only 4,000 souls, send a shock wave of terror across the continent? To understand the fear in the eyes of the watching monks, we must travel back 100 years into the bubble of the 1700s. Welcome to 18th century Lucerne. Imagine standing atop the ZYT Tower, where the city's oldest clock marks a time different from the rest of the world. In Paris, they are debating democracy. In London, the steam engine is beginning to turn. But here, time is frozen in medieval traditions and ironclad Catholic dogmas. The 9 towers of the Musegg Wall do not just protect against physical enemies, they are the boundaries of an ideology. Lucerne isolated itself not out of backwardness, but as a calculated choice by the elite to preserve a Catholic fortress. They believed that by stopping time, they could maintain their absolute power forever. Step into the Lucerne of 1750. The air here is thick with a specific, pungent scent. The smell of wet pine, horse manure, and the sharp mineral tang of salt. Do not let the jagged beauty of Mount Pilatus deceive you. This is not a mountain retreat. Lucerne is a machine powered by white gold. Below the chapel bridge, the Reuss River flows with an icy turquoise ferocity. Here, the heavy wooden boats are packed to the brim with sacks of salt. In an age before electricity, salt was the difference between survival and starvation. It was the only way to preserve meat through the brutal alpine winters. Lucerne held the keys to the White Highway, the only viable route connecting the markets of Germany to the hungry plains of Italy. The wealth this generated was staggering. Every grain of salt left a layer of gold in the pockets of the elite. But salt alone did not build the mansions of the corn-marked. Salt only preserved the food. To preserve their power, the masters of Lucerne traded in a much more expensive commodity. If salt was the white gold, then the young men of Lucerne were the red capital. This is the industry of tears. In the 1700s, Switzerland's most famous export was not chocolate or watches, it was death. The Swiss mercenary, the Reisläufer, was the finest war machine in Europe. In Lucerne, the mercenary trade was a sophisticated, cold-blooded business. Imagine a Sunday afternoon on the Chapel Bridge. A group of 20 young men, some barely 17, stand before a local patrician. The air smells of incense and the raw leather of their new boots. They are signing the capitulation, a military contract that sells their bodies to the King of France or the Pope in Rome. For the young men, it is an escape. But for the mothers watching from the shadows, it is a funeral held in advance. They know that of these 20 men, perhaps 5 will return, maimed, scarred, or broken by the Swiss sickness. The emotional cost was a silent epidemic. Behind the beautiful painted facades, there was a generation of ghost fathers and weeping widows. Yet, the system was ironclad. For every son sent to die in the mud of Flanders, the city's aristocratic families received a payment in gold. The paradox was brutal. Lucerne was a Catholic fortress of peace, yet its entire economy was lubricated by the blood of its children. The salt preserved the meat, but the blood preserved the power. To understand how the elite kept the people from revolting against this trade in blood, we must enter the Jesuit Church. This is the engine room of the Lucerne soul. As you step inside, the sensory shift is violent. Outside, the streets are gray, damp, and smell of the river. Inside, it is a hall of blinding white and exploding gold. This is Baroque architecture at its most manipulative. It is not meant to make you feel welcome. It is meant to make you feel conquered. Look up. The ceiling is not a roof. It is a trompe-l'œil, an optical illusion that makes the stone seem to dissolve into the clouds of heaven. You see saints swirling in a choreographed dance of pink marble and gold leaf. This is Baroque propaganda, the Counter-Reformation's answer to the cold intellectual challenge of the Protestants in Zurich. The Jesuits understood a profound psychological truth. If you can dazzle the eyes, you can bypass the mind. In an age where the common person lived in dark, cramped rooms, this church was the only cinema they had. It was a theater of the divine. Every detail is a calculated lesson in hierarchy. The massive pulpit, elevated high above the pews, reinforces a single message. Listen, do not question. The Latin liturgy, chanted in a language the common baker could not understand, added a layer of holy mystery. It suggested that God and the patrician families who funded this church operated on a level far above the understanding of ordinary mortals. This was the invisible wall. The Musegg towers kept out the enemy's cannons, but these golden altars kept out the enemy's ideas. The church taught the people that their suffering on earth, the loss of their sons to war, the crushing taxes on their bread, was a sacred sacrifice, a temporary shadow, before the golden light of the ceiling became their reality. But the control did not end at the church door. It moved into the very language people spoke. Lucerne was a city of two tongues. In the private salons of the Kornmarkt, the 20 patrician families, the gnädige Herren, or gracious lords, spoke French. They read Parisian newspapers, wore silk from Lyon, and discussed the philosophy of stability. Their world was elegant, refined, and static. But outside, in the narrow, lightless alleys where the sun rarely touched the ground, the people spoke Schweizerdeutsch, a thick, guttural, earthbound dialect. This linguistic barrier was an invisible fence. To climb the social ladder, you had to speak the language of the masters, but the masters made sure the ladder had no rungs. This was the guild system. Imagine you are a gifted carpenter. You have ideas for new designs, new tools. In Lucerne, you are forbidden from using them. You must belong to the guild. You must follow the rules established in the 1400s. You must charge the price the guild dictates. You must live where the guild commands. The guilds were the jailers of innovation. They ensured that no middle class could ever rise to challenge the patricians. If you were born a shoemaker, you died a shoemaker. If you were born a servant, your children would be servants. The city was a living fossil because the elite had figured out the ultimate secret to staying in power. They had turned the city into a clock that was wound so tightly, its hands could no longer move. By 1780, the stone cage began to smell of rot. No matter how many towers you build, or how many masses you chant in Latin, you cannot stop the wind. The very route that brought the white gold, the salt trade, became the city's undoing. The merchants who traveled to Basel and Frankfurt began to bring back more than just spices. Hidden in the false bottoms of salt barrels, tucked inside the bedrolls of returning mercenaries, came the contraband of the mind. Small, cheaply printed pamphlets, the forbidden words of Rousseau, the biting wit of Voltaire, the infection of liberty. In the damp, smoke-filled taverns near the river, away from the watchful eyes of the Jesuit priests, young men began to whisper. They looked at the golden ceiling of the church and saw not heaven, but the stolen wages of their dead brothers. They looked at the Musegg Wall and saw not protection, but a prison. The silence of Lucerne was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a pressure cooker. The air was thick with a new scent. Not salt, but the ozone of an approaching storm. When the French Revolutionary Army finally marched into Lucerne in 1798, they didn't have to tear down the walls. The living fossil shattered from within. As the French soldiers pulled down the symbolic statues of the guilds and threw them into the mud of the Rus, a strange thing happened. The people did not fight. They watched. Some in terror, yes, but many in a daze of sudden blinding light. The absolute power of the 20 families vanished in a single afternoon. The pension gold from the mercenary trade stopped flowing. The Latin Mass was no longer the law of the land. The clock, after 400 years of being frozen, suddenly began to tick. Today, Lucerne is a jewel of the world. Tourists from every corner of the globe walk across the chapel bridge, snapping photos of the painted triangles. They admire the Jesuit Church as a masterpiece of beauty. But as you walk these streets today, look closer at the stone. The Musegg Wall still stands, but it is a ghost. The Jesuit Church is still golden, but it is a concert hall for the soul, not a prison for the mind. Lucerne's journey reminds us that stability is often just another word for stagnation. The 18th century taught this city a brutal lesson. You can gild the cage, you can pray in a dead language, and you can trade blood for gold. But you cannot stop time. The living fossil had to die so that the modern city could be born. True wealth was never in the salt, and it was never in the mercenary gold. It was in the one thing the patricians feared most, the freedom to change. The heart of Switzerland still beats. It is no longer the ironclad beat of a medieval drum, but the diverse, chaotic, and beautiful pulse of a city that finally learned how to breathe. As the sun sets over Mount Pilatus today, the shadows of the 9 towers still stretch across the water. They are no longer boundaries. They are just shadows. And in the light of the 21st century, shadows have no power. Thank you for traveling through the architecture of silence. If you found this journey into the soul of history meaningful, please like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, is there a living fossil in your own world that is waiting to be awakened? Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface of the stone. Cha o tam biet, and see you in the flow of history.